There is a moment that defines a man's entire existence, a single snapshot in time that reveals the core of who he will become and the path he will carve through the world. For Donald Trump, that moment arrived when he was just 5 years old. Picture it vividly, the rumble of a massive bulldozer engine, shaking the ground beneath your feet in the outer boroughs of New York City, the air thick with the sharp smell of diesel fuel mixed with freshly turned earth, and the faint metallic tang of construction dust. Young Donald, barely tall enough to peer over the heavy controls, sat perched in the cabin like a king on his throne, his small hands gripping the levers with a surprising, almost instinctive determination that made the watching construction workers pause their labor and stare upward in a mix of amusement, concern, and quiet awe. His father, Fred Trump, had deliberately placed him there, not as some casual game or family outing, but as a calculated lesson in power, control, and the raw mechanics of the family business that would one day consume every aspect of his son's life. The boy felt the vibration of the machine pulse through his body, the sense of command surging through him as he tugged the controls, and watched the massive blade bite into the dirt below. This wasn't mere play. It was the symbolic transfer of ambition from father to son, a moment heavy with unspoken destiny that would echo through decades of towering skyscrapers, piercing the Manhattan skyline, dramatic financial collapses that tested the limits of resilience, explosive celebrity fame that turned his name into a global brand, and ultimately, the highest office in the land, where he would redefine what power truly meant. That little boy had no idea he would grow up to be the most polarizing figure in modern American politics, a man who would bend reality to his will, shatter norms, and reshape the very fabric of the nation. But the seeds of that future were planted right there, in the dirt and noise and unyielding steel of a Queens construction site, where a child's first taste of dominance planted roots that would grow into an empire. The story of Donald John Trump truly begins not in the shiny, gold-adorned penthouses of Manhattan that would later define his brand and dazzle the world with their excess, but in the more modest, upwardly mobile neighborhood of Jamaica, estates in Queens, a place where dreams of wealth were forged in the everyday grind of American life. Born on June 14, 1946, to Mary Ann MacLeod Trump, a Scottish immigrant who had crossed the vast and unforgiving Atlantic Ocean in search of a better life, leaving behind the rugged shores of her homeland with nothing but hope and determination. And Fred Trump, a German-American real estate developer who had clawed his way to success through sheer grit, savvy calculations, and an unshakable focus on building something lasting from the ground up. Fred's empire was built on providing affordable housing for working-class families in the outer boroughs, projects that housed thousands and turned empty lots into thriving communities. He was the opposite of flashy. Imagine him walking those same construction sites long after the sun had set and the workers had gone home, bending down in the fading light to pick up stray nails so they could be reused, saving every penny with a discipline that bordered on obsession, enforcing order in his business just as he would in his home. Fred had started with nothing an immigrant's son himself in many ways and turned it into substantial wealth through relentless work, smart deals with local government officials who saw his vision, and an unyielding focus on the bottom line that left no room for waste or weakness. His methods were methodical, almost military in their precision, a blueprint that his son would absorb and amplify in ways no one could have predicted at the time. Donald was the fourth of 5 children in this strict household, positioned in the middle of a family dynamic that rewarded strength and tested every limit, while his older brother, Fred Jr., was kind-hearted, easygoing, and eventually escaped the family pressure by becoming an airline pilot who soared above the tensions below. Donald was cut from a completely different cloth entirely. From a very young age, he displayed an aggressive, defiant spirit and an insatiable drive to come out on top in every situation, whether it was a game in the backyard or a battle of wits at the dinner table. Family dinners were battlegrounds where young Donald would argue with his father, his precocious tongue lashing out with arguments that both impressed and enraged the elder Trump, the air crackling with tension as plates clattered and voices rose. The household rules were ironclad. No nicknames that softened identity, no swearing that betrayed weakness, no makeup for the girls that suggested vanity, strict bedtimes that enforced discipline. Discipline was swift and sometimes physical, a reminder that the world rewarded those who could endure and dominate. But Donald pushed back relentlessly, testing every boundary with a calculated persistence, seemingly thriving on the conflict, as if it fueled his very soul. It was as if he was born with an internal compass that pointed only toward victory, no matter the cost or the opposition. His siblings would later recall how he refused to be cowed, accepting punishment as the price for asserting his independence and proving that no one could truly control him, that his will was a force unto itself. This defiance escalated as he grew older, turning from childhood mischief into something more serious and unmanageable. By 7th grade, the reports from school painted a picture of disruption and disrespect, teachers frustrated by a boy who questioned authority at every turn, and classmates drawn to his bold energy like moths to a flame. Then came the discovery that pushed his parents over the edge, a secret rebellion that revealed just how far Donald was willing to go. Donald had been sneaking off on the subway into Manhattan, that glittering island of opportunity across the river, buying switchblade knives from shady street vendors in the bustling crowds, and hiding them in his room like forbidden treasures. The image of their son arming himself in secret horrified Fred and Mary, stirring fears of what this unchecked spirit could lead to in a city full of dangers. It was the breaking point after months of escalating tension. Fred Trump, a man who valued order above all and had built his life on control, made a fateful decision that would shape everything that followed. At 13, Donald was packed off to the New York Military Academy, a strict boarding school nestled in the countryside of Cornwall-on-Hudson, far from the familiar streets of Queens. It felt like exile, a last-ditch effort to break the boy's will and mold him into something manageable, a place where structure would replace chaos. Most children would have crumbled under such rejection from their family, the sting of being sent away burning like abandonment. But Donald Trump saw it differently, turning the challenge into fuel for his fire. Upon arrival at the academy, he adapted with remarkable speed, as if the military environment had been waiting for him all along. The structured days, filled with drills and routines, the ranks that rewarded achievement, the competitions that pitted cadet against cadet, the clear chain of command that mirrored the hierarchy he craved, it all suited his competitive nature perfectly, like a glove tailored for his hand. He thrived on earning medals and promotions, rising quickly to corporal and then supply sergeant, the visible markers of superiority boosting his confidence with every step. Academically, he was average, hovering around the 80% mark, but in the arena of leadership and dominance, he excelled beyond measure. He wielded his authority over younger cadets with the same ruthlessness that would later define his business deals and political battles, issuing orders without hesitation and expecting obedience. There are stories from those years of intense confrontations that highlighted his unyielding nature, moments where the impulse to dominate surged forward. Even as a teenager, the drive to crush opposition through any means necessary was evident, a trait that turned potential setbacks into proofs of strength. He loved the military environment because it rewarded strength and punished weakness, mirroring the lessons his father had instilled on those construction sites years earlier. The academy didn't break him. It honed him, sharpening the edges of his personality into something sharper, more formidable, ready for the battles ahead in the concrete jungle of New York. He graduated in 1964, the weight of that structured world still clinging to him as he stepped into the next chapter, and enrolled at Fordham University in the Bronx, choosing it partially because his father disapproved of the decision, even while approving of the eventual ambition to attend Wharton. Trump was wealthy, from a prominent family, with connections that opened doors, and utterly unlike his peers in ways both obvious and subtle. Most students were working-class New Yorkers, taking the subway to campus every day, scraping by with part-time jobs and dreams of stability. Trump arrived as a driver who could have gone anywhere, his confidence radiating like an aura that set him apart. He joined the golf team, skipped classes when the weather was good and the greens called to him, and studied economics with the detached interest of someone who already believed he knew how to make money better than any textbook could teach. His grades were respectable, but not exceptional, hovering in that solid middle ground that satisfied requirements without dazzling professors. What he was exceptional at was selling himself, at creating the perception of success, at convincing others that he was smarter, richer, and more accomplished than the evidence actually supported. He moved through campus like a man already destined for greater things, the lessons of the academy and his father's sights blending into a persona that demanded attention. After 2 years, he transferred to Wharton, as he always planned, arriving at the elite business school in Philadelphia and immediately beginning to construct a narrative that would define his life from that point forward. He claimed he was among the top of his class, one of the best students in his year, the kind of bold assertion that made people listen and wonder. The reality was different, of course, but reality was never the point for Donald Trump. He graduated with an economics degree, but he did not make the honor roll. He was not exceptional academically. What he was exceptional at was selling himself, at creating compelling narratives about himself, at understanding that in America, if you say something with enough confidence and repeat it often enough, people will believe it. This skill, honed in the classrooms and on the golf courses, would become the foundation for everything that came next, a tool sharper than any bulldozer blade. He graduated in 1968, stepping out into a world on the cusp of massive change, and instead of being drafted for Vietnam, Trump had the good fortune or the good planning to have received student deferments, and then a medical exemption for bone spurs that kept him from the jungles and the draft. The bone spurs were never clearly documented in a way that satisfied every question, and Trump could never quite remember which foot troubled him when asked about it years later, the details shifting like sand under pressure. When the draft lottery came, his birthday was number 356 out of 366, a lucky draw that spared him the call to arms. He would never serve. Later, Trump would say he was opposed to the war, that he was not a fan of Vietnam and its endless toll. But he would also claim, years later, that not serving was one of his regrets, that he would have been honored to fight if the circumstances had been different. The contradiction would become characteristic of Trump's relationship with the truth, his ability to hold completely incompatible positions simultaneously, and to believe each of them with absolute conviction, a talent that allowed him to navigate any storm. His father gave him what Trump would later describe as a small $1 million loan, a phrase that would become his favorite description of his initial capital, repeated like a mantra to frame his story as one of pure self-made triumph. The actual amount was likely much larger, possibly $10 to $14 million in today's money adjusted for inflation. But the phrase small loan of $1 million would become Trump's preferred framing of his initial start, a story he told with such conviction that it shaped how the world saw him. It was the first great deception in the Trump narrative, a foundational lie that would support everything that followed. He was not a self-made man pulling himself up by his bootstraps in the classic American tradition. He was a wealthy man's son, given vast resources and the family connections to use them effectively. He was a man born on third base who would spend his entire life insisting he had hit a triple, turning every advantage into proof of his genius. Trump started in his father's business, working in Brooklyn and learning the mechanics of real estate development, tax abatements, and government relationships in ways that his father's generation had mastered through years of patient deal-making. In 1971, at just 25 years old, he became president of the company. A rapid rise that signaled the transfer of power was complete. His father stepped back into the chairman role, watching as his son took increasingly aggressive actions that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. But Donald had bigger ambitions than Brooklyn and its row houses. He looked across the East River to Manhattan, and what he saw was destiny calling his name. He saw the greatest real estate market in the world, a skyline waiting to be claimed, and he saw a way to dominate it completely. He believed, with an almost delusional certainty that bordered on vision, that he alone possessed the vision and the will to reshape Manhattan in his image, turning crumbling blocks into monuments to success. New York City in the mid-1970s was dying, a metropolis on the brink of collapse that tested the resolve of even the boldest dreamers. The city was bankrupt, literally unable to meet its obligations, as debts piled up and services crumbled. Crime was surging, the murder rate had jumped 130% in just 2 years, creating a climate of fear throughout the city that made streets feel like battlegrounds after dark. Businesses were fleeing to the suburbs or to other cities entirely, taking jobs and hope with them. The urban landscape was crumbling, with abandoned buildings on nearly every block standing like ghosts of better days. This is exactly when most developers would retreat to safer investments, would pull back and wait for conditions to improve, letting others take the risks. But Trump saw it differently. He saw opportunity in the chaos, a city so broken that someone willing to be bold enough could reshape it entirely in his vision. His father thought he was insane, warning of the dangers and the potential for ruin. But Trump convinced him to invest anyway, leveraging his father's proven track record and his own unshakable self-confidence that turned doubt into momentum. He obtained options on 3 of the most valuable properties in New York: the bankrupt Commodore Hotel at Grand Central Station and 2 enormous rail yards on the west side of Manhattan. The Commodore was a decrepit structure, its lobby so dingy it looked like a welfare hotel from another era, its rooms occupied by homeless people and addicts seeking shelter from the streets. No one wanted it. It was a symbol of New York's decline, a fading landmark in a city that seemed to be fading too. But Trump saw something else entirely. He saw the thousands of commuters pouring out of Grand Central every day, desperate for a place to stay close to the action. He saw the location, the potential, the geometry of the deal that could turn desperation into profit. He understood that this was not about buildings, but about extracting value from municipal desperation, turning the city's weakness into his strength. This is when Trump's true genius emerged, not in innovation, not in construction, not in authentic business creation from scratch, but in manipulation of systems and perceptions that others overlooked. He had something those properties needed: the promise of a partnership with the Hyatt hotel chain that brought credibility and capital. He had something the city needed: a developer willing to take on massive risk in a dying neighborhood when everyone else was fleeing. He negotiated a 40-year tax abatement from the city worth approximately $400 million, a deal that required navigating halls of power with charm and pressure. He guaranteed loans through his father's political connections, calling in favors that opened doors. He leveraged every advantage he possessed, no matter how unfair it seemed to outsiders, to assemble the deal that would launch him. The system was working for him because he understood how to work the system better than anyone else. He understood that in real estate, as in politics, who you know matters more than what you know, and he knew everyone who mattered. The transformation of the Commodore Hotel into the Grand Hyatt was Trump's first masterpiece, a phoenix rising from the ashes of urban decay. It was a public success that established him as a major player in Manhattan real estate, the kind of win that made headlines and turned skeptics into believers. The building gleamed with new life after renovation, its facade polished and inviting, attracting tourists and business travelers from around the world who filled its rooms and restaurants. It made money, steady profits that flowed back into his growing empire. And most importantly, it made Donald Trump famous in New York City. Newspapers covered him constantly, their stories painting him as a bold visionary. He gave interviews boasting about his success in ways that were almost comical in their self-congratulation. Yet they worked because he delivered them with absolute conviction. He cultivated relationships with journalists who were fascinated by his brashness and his willingness to self-promote without shame or hesitation. He understood, long before social media made it obvious, that in America, perception creates reality, that the story you tell about yourself is more important than the truth, and he told his story louder than anyone. But Trump's ambition stretched far beyond one hotel, a hunger that seemed impossible to satisfy no matter how much he achieved. He had purchased options on the West Side rail yards, and he began developing plans for the most ambitious real estate project anyone had ever proposed. He would build Riverside South, a development that would include nearly 8,000 apartments, millions of square feet of office space, studio space for television and film production, thousands of parking spaces, and retail areas that buzzed with life. It would be, in his telling, the greatest development project in the history of New York City, in the history of America, in the history of the world. It would dwarf all previous developments. It would transform the entire city. It was a fantasy wrapped in architectural renderings and bold promises that captured the imagination even as it invited opposition. This is when Trump encountered something he could not manipulate his way past: politics and community resistance that proved as stubborn as he was. The Upper West Side of Manhattan rose up in opposition, residents organizing against what they saw as an imposition on their neighborhood. Community boards mobilized with meetings that stretched late into the night. Environmentalists organized protests and petitions. Politicians wavered, caught between development promises and local concerns. Trump's aggressive approach, his insistence, his dismissiveness of concerns, his absolute certainty that he was right did not work in this case. He made demands. They said no. He made bigger demands. They still said no. He tried to pressure the mayor with threats and alliances. The mayor resisted. He tried to create public pressure through the media, leaking stories and calling reporters. It backfired, creating a narrative of an arrogant developer trying to impose his will on a community that did not want him, a story that lingered like a shadow. For years, the Riverside South project stalled, dragged down by hearings and lawsuits, and endless negotiations that tested his patience. Trump could not force it through. He could not bully it into existence with the same ease as his earlier deals. This was perhaps the first major failure of his career, though he would never admit it as such, framing every delay as a strategic pause. Instead, he shifted his focus. He began developing other properties. He would eventually return to Riverside, South years later, with a modified proposal. But for now, he needed a new victory, something that would show that he had not been diminished by this setback. He needed a way to remind New York and himself that he was unstoppable, a force that could not be denied for long. He began developing other properties in Manhattan, each project more ambitious than the last, stacking successes like floors on a skyscraper. And he found a new ambition that would define the next chapter of his life. In 1978, Trump turned his attention to Trump Tower, a site on Fifth Avenue where the Bonwit Teller department store stood, a location that had been his dream since childhood. A tower on Fifth Avenue at 56th Street, one of the most valuable pieces of real estate in the world. He began negotiations to purchase the building, to demolish it, and to construct a new tower in its place. The negotiations were extraordinarily complex and required him to navigate through a labyrinth of interests and regulations that would have overwhelmed lesser men. He had to deal with the property owner, the department store that leased the space, the owners of the air rights above the building, the city agencies that controlled zoning and development. Every step was a battle of wits and wills. Trump's approach to negotiation was distinctive and would become his signature method, a blend of charm, pressure, and unyielding demands. He would set unreasonable demands, then use the other side's resistance as leverage to extract more. He would play parties against each other, offering one group something if they would pressure another group. He would make public statements about deals that were still being negotiated, essentially holding the parties hostage to avoid embarrassment. He would threaten legal action, media exposure, political pressure. He would do whatever it took to win, calling reporters and leaking information about negotiations to create pressure on the other parties. He would use the newspapers as a weapon, understanding that once something was printed in the New York Times or the Post, the narrative became real regardless of its accuracy. The results were stunning. Trump assembled all the necessary approvals and agreements through a combination of persuasion, threats, and deal-making that left everyone involved simultaneously impressed and disturbed. He began construction in 1979, and in 1983, Trump Tower opened to the world. The building was a masterpiece of aesthetic arrogance, 58 stories of gleaming glass and bronze, topped by a triplex penthouse that Trump would make his primary residence. The building contained luxury condominiums, office space, and ground floor retail that attracted the elite. It was designed to be a monument to wealth and power, and it was. It changed the Manhattan skyline forever, a glittering beacon that announced his arrival. Trump himself occupied the penthouse on the top 3 floors, nearly 30,000 square feet of space, though he would later claim it was closer to 50,000 in interviews that stretched the truth for effect. The apartment was decorated in gold. The designer Angelo Donghia had created spaces with chocolate walls, bronze mirrors, and gold leaf ceilings that shimmered under lights. When Trump later had it redecorated, he ordered even more gold, layering it on until the excess was undeniable. The design was so excessive, so utterly lacking in restraint, that design critics would later describe it as dictator chic, the aesthetic of an authoritarian strongman who equated gold with power, who believed that wealth should be visible and undeniable, and crushing in its obviousness. The apartments in Trump Tower sold out almost immediately, buyers lining up for the chance to own a piece of the Trump dream. The building was a financial success, generating revenue that fueled further expansions. And Trump was now one of the most prominent real estate developers in New York City. He was wealthy, famous, and driven by a hunger that seemed impossible to satisfy. He wanted more. He wanted everything. He wanted to prove that he was not just wealthy, but that he was the wealthiest, the most successful, the most important figure in New York City. This drive pushed him forward into new territories, setting the stage for the excesses and the falls that would test him like never before. It was in the late 1980s that Trump's ambitions expanded beyond real estate into a whirlwind of ventures that spread his name like wildfire. He wanted to be everywhere, to have his name on everything from hotels to airlines to yachts. He purchased the Plaza Hotel, one of the most iconic buildings in New York City, for $400 million, turning it into a symbol of luxury under his control. He acquired properties in Atlantic City and began building casinos with visions of becoming a gambling magnate who dominated the boardwalk. He bought a yacht that he named Trump Princess, a floating palace of opulence that hosted the elite. He purchased the Eastern Airlines shuttle and rebranded it as the Trump Shuttle, promising first-class service in the skies. He was empire building in the most literal sense, spreading his name across industries and properties and ventures, like a conqueror planting flags in newly conquered territory, each acquisition adding to the legend he was crafting. This is when cracks began to appear in the foundation, subtle at first, but widening with every bold move. The reality underneath the glittering facade was far less solid than the facade suggested, a truth that lurked beneath the surface like hidden debts. The casinos in Atlantic City were disasters from the start. Trump had entered the gambling industry with supreme confidence, convinced that his business acumen would translate seamlessly to casino management. It did not. The Trump Taj Mahal, the Trump Plaza, and the Trump Marina lost money relentlessly, bleeding cash in a city where competition was fierce, and the house edge wasn't always enough. The properties went through bankruptcy after bankruptcy, restructuring after restructuring. Competitors with less famous names performed better, their operations leaner and smarter. Trump's casinos shed employees and revenue at rates worse than their competitors. While other Atlantic City casinos struggled in the tough economy, Trump's were catastrophes that made headlines for all the wrong reasons. But here is the crucial thing about Trump. He never admitted failure, not in public and rarely even to himself. When the casinos went bankrupt, he framed it as a smart business tactic, a clever use of the system that others were too timid to employ. When asked about the Atlantic City debacle in interviews, he would say that he had simply used bankruptcy law, which was an effective and commonly used practice, to restructure a business. The fact that other developers did not use bankruptcy as frequently, that his casinos performed worse than competitors, that thousands of workers lost their jobs and retirement savings, none of that penetrated Trump's narrative. He had learned early that if you said something with enough confidence, if you repeated it often enough, people would believe it, and he repeated his version until it stuck. During the 2004 bankruptcy of Trump hotels and casino resorts, Trump increased his own salary from $1.5 million to $2 million, while the company bled losses. As CEO, he made approximately $3.2 million per year, more than 120 times the average salary of his employees, who toiled on the casino floors. The corporation lost hundreds of millions of dollars in the process. Workers who had invested their retirement savings in company stock were forced to sell at massive losses. More than 400 employees lost over $2 million in total, their dreams of security shattered. Trump walked away intact, his personal wealth untouched, having transferred his debts onto shareholders and creditors who bore the brunt. This pattern would repeat throughout Trump's career like a recurring theme in a dramatic saga. He would take on massive debt to fuel growth. He would leverage assets to the hilt. When the debt became impossible to manage, he would file for bankruptcy, shedding the obligations while protecting his personal wealth. He would emerge claiming victory, spinning the story as a triumph of strategy. The workers, the investors, the small contractors, they would absorb the losses, picking up the pieces. Trump's strategy was to privatize gains and socialize losses, to ensure that he always came out ahead, regardless of the outcome, a masterclass in self-preservation that defined his approach. Between 1986 and 2016, Trump and his organizations were parties to 4,095 lawsuits. That is roughly one lawsuit every 3 days for 30 years, a staggering number that spoke to his combative style. He used litigation as a weapon, not just to defend himself, but to attack others, to stiff contractors into accepting less than they were owed, to intimidate competitors and critics into silence. He would sue media outlets over negative stories that dared to question him. He would sue activists who opposed his developments. He would sue to enforce non-disclosure agreements and prevent people from speaking about their experiences with him. His legal strategy was designed to exhaust opponents through the sheer cost and time of litigation, to overwhelm them with the machinery of the legal system until they gave up or broke. By the early 1990s, Trump faced a genuine crisis that threatened to topple everything he had built. His Atlantic City casinos were hemorrhaging money at an alarming rate. The real estate market had crashed, leaving properties over-leveraged and underperforming. His ability to borrow had evaporated as banks that had once competed to lend him money now wanted nothing to do with him. He was facing financial ruin on a scale that could have ended his empire for good. His entire empire, everything he had built, everything he had promised the world was collapsing around him, like a house of cards in a storm. The man who had seemed invincible, the developer who could not be stopped, was on the brink of disaster, staring into the abyss. This is when Trump made a decision that saved his life and set the stage for his greatest reinvention. He realized that he could not build his way out of this crisis with more properties or developments. He could not acquire enough assets to recover from the losses through traditional means, but he could rebuild through branding, through the one asset that had survived intact: his name and the celebrity it carried. Trump was already famous in New York, but he was becoming increasingly famous nationwide, especially after his multiple marriages and affairs had been plastered across tabloid newspapers with salacious detail that fed the public's appetite for drama. He had a public persona. He had celebrity. He decided to monetize it completely, turning fame into a business model. Trump began licensing his name to other developers around the world, a brilliant pivot that changed the game. He would not build the buildings himself. Instead, he would partner with other companies, allow them to use the Trump brand in exchange for a percentage of the profits or development fees that flowed to him with little risk. Trump Tower Istanbul, Trump Tower Baku, Trump hotels in Las Vegas, in Florida, in locations around the world that he might never visit. Trump golf courses, Trump casinos, Trump-branded real estate projects in places Trump himself had never been. He was spreading his name like a virus across the globe, transforming it into a commodity that could be sold to anyone willing to pay for the association. This strategy was brilliant and cynical in equal measure, a masterstroke of perception over substance. Trump could spread his name without the massive capital investment required to actually build and manage properties. He could cash in on his celebrity status without bearing the risks of property ownership or the headaches of daily operations. If a Trump-branded building failed, the developers and investors bore the losses. Trump received his licensing fees and moved on to the next deal. He had found a way to make money without actually producing value in the traditional sense, to extract wealth from the world simply by virtue of his name and the story it told. By the 1990s, Trump was everywhere in American popular culture, a fixture in the national consciousness. He appeared on television regularly, his face and voice becoming familiar to millions. He was a guest on shows like Howard Stern's radio program, where he discussed his sex life, his business deals, and his opinions on politics with a frankness that shocked audiences and kept them tuned in. He made cameo appearances in films and television shows, always playing a version of himself that amplified the myth. He released a ghost-written memoir titled The Art of the Deal, which became a bestseller, and cemented his status as a business genius in the public imagination. The book was pure fiction in many ways. Trump's ghostwriter, Tony Schwartz, would later express regret over the project, calling it his greatest regret in life. The stories in the book were exaggerated, embellished, or invented entirely to fit the narrative. The book presented Trump as a brilliant negotiator, a visionary entrepreneur, a man who never made mistakes. The actual Trump, the one who had bankrupted casinos, who had created massive debt, who had used legal tactics that destroyed ordinary people's lives, was erased from the narrative, replaced by the legend. Trump's celebrity grew exponentially with each appearance and deal. And then came the opportunity that would transform him from a regional real estate figure into a global brand, watched by hundreds of millions of people around the world. In 2003, television producer Mark Burnett approached Trump with a concept for a reality television show. Trump was skeptical at first. He thought reality television was for the bottom feeders of society, but Burnett made a compelling pitch. The show would feature Trump as the star, a successful businessman with a luxurious lifestyle, presiding over a competition among ambitious young people who would compete for the chance to work for him. The show would be called The Apprentice. The premise was simple and elegant, designed to hook viewers week after week. A group of contestants would undertake business challenges, designed to test their entrepreneurial acumen in real-world settings. Trump would sit in a boardroom with his advisors, and at the end of each episode, he would fire one contestant, uttering what would become his most famous catchphrase. "You're fired." The format was engaging, simple, and it placed Trump at the absolute center of every episode, the ultimate judge and authority. The show debuted in January 2004 and became an enormous hit almost overnight. It was appointment television. Millions of Americans watched every week, drawn to the drama and the glamour. Trump was presented as a brilliant businessman, a tough but fair boss, a man of supreme confidence and absolute certainty in his judgments. The reality behind the scenes was far more complicated. Trump's offices were too small and shabby for a show meant to project wealth and success, so the production team rented vacant space from Trump and constructed an illusion of luxury with sets and lighting. Trump's own dialogue was often edited and rewritten to make him sound more articulate and coherent. The show was constructed reality, carefully crafted to present a specific image of Donald Trump to the American public. But the image worked like magic. For millions of Americans, The Apprentice was their primary exposure to Trump. They saw a man of success, of power, of absolute certainty. They did not see the bankruptcies. They did not see the destroyed businesses. They did not see the workers who had lost their retirement savings. They saw what Trump wanted them to see: a winner. The show ran for 14 seasons and made Trump approximately $214 million. But more importantly, it made him a household name across the country. It rebranded him as a business sage, a man whose opinions on success and strategy were worth hearing. When Trump signed copies of The Art of the Deal at bookstores, people lined up for hours. He was the embodiment of the American dream, a man who had made himself into a billionaire through his own genius and determination. None of it was true in the literal sense, but the truth did not matter. What mattered was the story, and Trump had mastered the art of storytelling. Throughout the early 2000s, Trump continued to license his name to developers around the world, building a global brand that reached every corner. He also became politically active in a new way, shifting his donations and his rhetoric. He had been a registered Democrat for much of his business career, making donations to Democratic candidates and causes that aligned with his interests at the time. But as his wealth increased and his celebrity grew, his political donations shifted dramatically toward Republicans. By 2010, he was giving almost exclusively to Republican candidates and causes. He was aligning himself with the political party that best reflected his economic interests and his worldview of strength and America first. In interviews, Trump began making vague comments about possibly running for president, testing the waters every few years to see what kind of attention he could generate. In 2012, he spent months suggesting that he might challenge Barack Obama. He raised conspiracy theories about Obama's birthplace, questions about whether the president was truly born in America. Trump became the most prominent voice of the birther movement, a conspiracy theory that was factually baseless and tinged with division. He demanded to see Obama's long-form birth certificate, as if he had the authority to demand such a thing from the highest office. When Obama released the certificate, Trump simply claimed it was a forgery. When Obama won re-election decisively, Trump took to Twitter to express his outrage. He called for a revolution and suggested that the election had been rigged. Then he moved on to other pursuits, the flirtation with politics simmering beneath the surface. But in the years following Obama's presidency, something shifted in Trump's thinking. As he watched the political landscape evolve, he saw the rise of anti-establishment sentiment across the country. He perceived the anger among working-class Americans who felt left behind by globalization and technological change. He recognized that these voters were hungry for someone who would speak to their grievances directly, without the filter of political correctness or polite debate. He saw an opportunity that no one else could see, or that everyone else was too afraid to seize, a path to the ultimate prize. In June 2015, at 70 years old, Donald Trump descended the escalator in Trump Tower with his third wife, Melania, and made an announcement that would shake American politics to its foundations. He was running for president. The announcement was characteristically Trump. He spoke for 90 minutes, rambling and bragging and making claims that were often grotesque and occasionally false. He said that Mexico was not sending its best people, that they were sending people who brought drugs and crime, that they were rapists. He said he would build a wall on the southern border and that Mexico would pay for it. He said he would make America great again, a phrase that would become his campaign slogan and his political brand, chanted at rallies that grew larger and louder. The establishment dismissed him immediately as a joke. He was a reality television star with no political experience. He had bankrupted multiple businesses. He was a serial liar and an apparent narcissist. The Republican Party hierarchy wanted nothing to do with him. They had better candidates, seasoned politicians with experience in government, senators and governors with real track records. They believed he would be a catastrophe, that he would embarrass the party and alienate voters. But Trump understood something about American politics that the establishment did not. He understood that voters were not looking for experience or policy knowledge. They were looking for someone who would fight for them, someone who would take on the system that had excluded them, someone who would validate their anger and their sense that they had been cheated. He understood that authenticity, or the performance of authenticity, was more valuable than competence. He understood that voters wanted someone who would say the things they were thinking, but were afraid to say out loud. Trump's campaign was unlike anything American politics had ever seen. He attacked his opponents with brutal personal insults that shocked the political world. He called them names. He questioned their competence, their sexuality, their appearance. He spread conspiracy theories and made claims that were provably false. He mocked a disabled journalist. He made crude jokes about women. He suggested violence against his political opponents, saying he would pay the legal fees of supporters who assaulted protesters. He violated every norm of presidential campaigning, turning rallies into spectacles of raw emotion. The media covered him obsessively. Every day brought a new controversy, a new outrageous statement, a new scandal. But the coverage, even when critical, gave him attention that money could not buy. Cable news networks would devote entire hours to analyzing his latest statement. He became omnipresent on television. His opponents, who had spent decades building name recognition and political credibility, were overshadowed by his constant media presence. He was everywhere. He was inescapable. The more they attacked him, the stronger he seemed. The Republican establishment tried to stop him with super PACs and debates and endorsements. They ran better-funded candidates. They organized against him. But Trump dominated the primary elections. He won state after state. His opponents dropped out one by one. By the time of the Republican convention, he had secured the nomination. He had taken the party away from the establishment, rewriting the rules in real time. The 2016 general election campaign was the most divisive in recent American history. Trump ran against Hillary Clinton, the Democratic nominee and former Secretary of State. Clinton was the embodiment of the establishment that Trump was running against. She was a career politician, a Washington insider, a woman who represented the old order. She was everything Trump positioned himself against. The campaign was brutal. Trump made attacks on Clinton that his supporters found exhilarating and his opponents found obscene. He called her Crooked Hillary. He talked about her email server with obsessive repetition. He suggested at campaign rallies that his supporters lock her up, creating the chant "lock her up," which would echo through his events like a mantra. He weaponized her perceived weaknesses and amplified them until they dominated the conversation. Trump also made a strategic decision that would prove crucial. He focused his campaign resources on a small number of states that had voted for Obama, but that might be persuaded to support him. Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. These were states that had been devastated by deindustrialization, where manufacturing jobs had disappeared, where working-class voters felt betrayed by both major parties. Trump promised he would bring those jobs back. He promised he would renegotiate trade deals. He promised he would put America first. The crowds at his rallies grew larger, the energy electric. Clinton was favored to win. All the polls showed her leading. The major publications endorsed her. The experts predicted a Democratic victory. But on election night 2016, something unexpected happened that stunned the nation. Trump won Pennsylvania. He won Michigan. He won Wisconsin. He won the Electoral College by a margin of 306 to 232. Even though Clinton won the popular vote, by nearly 3 million votes. The most unlikely outcome had occurred. A reality television star, with no political experience, had been elected President of the United States. The shock across the country was visceral. Supporters celebrated in the streets with tears and cheers. Opponents wept in disbelief. The world watched in stunned silence. Trump had done something that almost no one believed possible. He had taken the presidency from the establishment, and in doing so, he had changed American politics forever. The old rules seemed to no longer apply. A man who violated every norm, who had no qualifications, who was utterly unlike any president before him, had won the presidency. Trump's presidency from 2017 to 2021 was unprecedented and polarizing from the very first day. His supporters viewed him as a fighter who was taking on the corrupt establishment and making good on his campaign promises with bold action. His opponents viewed him as a dangerous authoritarian whose presidency threatened American democracy itself. He appointed Supreme Court justices who shifted the court to the right for a generation, reshaping the legal landscape. He implemented aggressive immigration policies, including separating families at the border, in ways that sparked national debate. He withdrew the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement, removing America from global leadership on environmental issues. He cut taxes, primarily benefiting corporations and wealthy individuals in moves that boosted the economy for some, but widened gaps for others. He pursued an erratic foreign policy that confused allies and emboldened adversaries. He was impeached twice by the House of Representatives, once for pressuring Ukraine to investigate his political opponent, and once for inciting the mob that stormed the Capitol on January 6, 2021. Each event added layers to the drama, keeping the nation on edge. Throughout his presidency, Trump remained engaged in what could only be described as an obsessive relationship with media coverage. He posted constantly on Twitter, sharing grievances, attacking opponents, and spreading misinformation that fueled division. The White House announced that his tweets should be considered official statements. He held rallies constantly, using them as platforms to repeat his grievances and build his brand. He seemed incapable of letting any criticism go unanswered. He was obsessed with crowd size, television ratings, and how his presidency was being covered. This constant engagement kept the story alive, day after day. In 2020, Trump ran for re-election against Democrat Joe Biden. The election took place during the COVID-19 pandemic, which Trump had consistently downplayed, despite mounting deaths that affected every community. Trump claimed he had built the strongest economy in history, but unemployment was surging due to the pandemic. Voters broke sharply along partisan lines, with Trump's base remaining intensely loyal, while opponents viewed him as a catastrophic failure. Biden won the election decisively. Trump received 232 electoral votes to Biden's 306. In the popular vote, Biden won by over 7 million votes. But Trump refused to accept the result. He claimed without evidence that the election had been rigged, that he had actually won by a landslide, that fraud had stolen the presidency from him. He pressured state election officials to overturn results. He filed dozens of lawsuits challenging the election and lost everyone. He pressured Congress to reject the electoral votes. And on January 6, 2021, he held a rally near the Capitol, where he told his supporters to march on the building and fight like hell. A mob of his supporters, inflamed by his rhetoric and the rhetoric of other Republican politicians, stormed the Capitol, broke windows, invaded offices, and attacked police officers. The building was evacuated. Congress members hid or were evacuated. 5 people died in the chaos. Trump released a video telling his supporters to go home, but he took days to clearly condemn the violence. When he left office 10 days later, he had not formally conceded the election. For much of the Republican Party, and for Trump's base of supporters, what had happened was not a breaking point, but a rallying point. They did not view January 6 as a catastrophe. They viewed it as a sign of Trump's supporters' devotion, their willingness to fight for him. Trump's supporters believed that the election had been stolen, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, because Trump had told them it was true, and they trusted him above all. For the next several years, Trump was banned from social media platforms, including Twitter and Facebook. He was indicted on numerous criminal charges for allegedly mishandling classified documents, for allegedly pressuring Ukraine, for allegedly attempting to overturn the 2020 election in Georgia, and for allegedly falsifying business records in New York in connection with hush money payments to an adult film actress. He faced 4 separate indictments, bringing charges against him personally. The walls seem to be closing in, the legal system grinding forward. In May 2024, Trump was convicted on 34 felony charges related to falsifying business records. He became the first former president of the United States to be convicted of a crime. He faced potential prison time, though sentencing was repeatedly delayed. He became a criminal in the eyes of the law. Yet as the 2024 election approached, Trump ran for president again. The Republican Party unified behind him almost completely. His base remained as devoted as ever. He survived 2 assassination attempts, one of which wounded him but left him defiant, even more energized, blood on his face as he raised his fist in a moment captured forever in photos. And on November 5, 2024, Trump won the presidential election again. He defeated Vice President Kamala Harris decisively, winning the Electoral College 312 to 226. He won all 7 swing states. He won the popular vote with 49.8% of the vote, the first Republican to win the popular vote since George W. Bush in 2004. He became only the 2nd president in American history, after Grover Cleveland, to be elected to a non-consecutive 2nd term. He had been written off. He had been defeated. He had faced criminal conviction. And yet he had returned to the presidency with a mandate that felt like destiny fulfilled. Trump's return to the White House in January 2025 was triumphant. His supporters believed that he had been vindicated, that the system had tried to destroy him and failed, that he had risen from the ashes like a phoenix to claim his rightful place as president. His opponents were horrified, watching a convicted felon assume the highest office in the land. The country was more divided than ever, the air thick with tension and anticipation. In his 2nd term, Trump moved with extraordinary speed and aggression that left Washington reeling. He signed more than 130 executive orders in his first 100 days, surpassing Franklin Roosevelt's record of 99. He deployed National Guard troops to American cities, ostensibly to combat crime. He initiated mass deportation operations targeting undocumented immigrants. He imposed sweeping tariffs on trading partners. He created a Department of Government Efficiency headed by Elon Musk, aimed at reducing the federal government's size and scope. He was reshaping the government in his image, moving fast and breaking norms. His administration pursued a legal and political agenda that critics found deeply troubling. His lawyers made arguments about presidential power that, if accepted, would have expanded executive authority far beyond historical norms. He moved to end birthright citizenship through executive order, claiming to have absolute power to do so. He resisted the release of documents related to Jeffrey Epstein and his alleged associates. Despite congressional pressure, he was consolidating power at an unprecedented pace, each move adding to the legend. By March 2026, Trump's 2nd term was already reshaping America's political, economic, and legal landscape. His administration had faced hundreds of legal challenges to its policies. His approval ratings remained polarized, with supporters viewing him as a transformative president and opponents viewing him as a dangerous authoritarian. The nation was at a crossroads, the future uncertain, but charged with the energy of change. But this is the essential truth about Donald Trump. He is not a conventional figure, operating within the normal constraints of American politics. He is an extraordinary phenomenon, a man who has repeatedly defied expectations, overcome catastrophes, and reinvented himself when necessary. He was a bankrupt real estate developer who became a television star. He was a reality television personality who became president. He was a one-term president who lost the popular vote twice and was convicted of crimes, who faced impeachment twice and legal indictment numerous times, and who still managed to win election again. Each chapter built on the last, a story of resilience that defied logic. Whether one views Trump as a visionary populist who shattered the grip of the corrupt establishment, or as a dangerous authoritarian who has poisoned American democracy, one cannot deny that his rise represents one of the most extraordinary and improbable political trajectories in American history. He has taken his name from a marginal identity to one of the most recognized brands in the world. He has built an empire through audacity, shamelessness, and an almost supernatural resilience that bounces back from catastrophe as though it were an opportunity. The boy on the bulldozer became the man who refused to accept limits, and in doing so, he changed everything. The story of Donald Trump is ultimately a story about American power, American celebrity, American media, and American politics. It is a story about what is possible when someone refuses to accept the rules that constrain others, when someone is willing to lie with such confidence that millions of people believe the lies, when someone understands that, in the age of mass media and social networks, narrative is more powerful than reality. It is a story about the American dream and the American nightmare, existing in the same person, intertwined in ways that fascinate and repel. Whether his second term will be remembered as a transformative presidency that revitalized American power and prosperity, or a catastrophic failure that damaged American institutions and democracy itself, remains to be seen. But one thing is certain: the rise and return of Donald Trump is one of the most significant and transformative political phenomena of the 21st century. He has fundamentally altered the trajectory of American history and reshaped the nature of presidential politics. He has demonstrated that the rules that constrained previous politicians no longer apply, that traditional qualifications and experience no longer matter, that a man with shamelessness and media savvy can ascend to the highest office in the land twice. Trump's legacy is being written in real time. Each day of his presidency writes another chapter. Each decision, each executive order, each conflict reshapes America's future. What will ultimately be remembered is still uncertain. But what cannot be denied is that this man, born in the outer boroughs of New York City, who played with bulldozers as a child, who refused to accept limits, who understood the power of narrative, who weaponized celebrity, and used media better than anyone before him, has fundamentally changed America. His name is etched into the timeline of the nation. His impact will be felt for generations to come, whether for good or ill. He represents a moment when American politics transformed, when the traditional rules of politics seemed to no longer apply, when a man who should have been unelectable became president twice. And in that story, the boy on the bulldozer still sits at the controls, steering the nation into uncharted territory.